A lone rider cut through the storm, his dark silhouette barely visible against the flickering light of the heavens. His horse was a streak of muscle and panic, hooves pounding the soaked ground as though the very storm chased him. The rider clutched his side where blood seeped between his fingers, mixing with the rain. Every breath came sharp, but he did not slow. He couldn't. They were hunting him. Behind him, across the vast expanse of the storm-swept land, shadows followed. More riders, moving as swift as a wind, their war cries swallowed by the storm. His own people, his own brothers. But they would not call him brother now. Lone Eagle knew the cost of his actions. There would be no mercy if they caught him. A traitor to Comanche was worse than an enemy. Enemies died with honor. Traitors died in agony. Lightning ripped the sky apart, revealing the land ahead, a dry creek bed. The earth cracked and split from the last drought. He turned his horse toward it, urging the beast forward. He could still hear the distant beat of hooves behind him. Too close. They would find him soon. But he had to keep riding. He had made a promise. Not far behind him, shivering beneath the overhang of a rock, a woman sat huddled in the dark. Her dress, torn and muddied, clung to her thin frame as the rain pounded against her skin. She pressed herself against the stone, trembling, ears straining to hear over the storm. Eliza Monroe had stopped praying hours ago. Or was it days? Time had blurred since the night the Comanche came, since her father had been ripped from her arms, since the flames swallowed her home. The screams still echoed in her mind, tangled with the distant sound of war cries and gunfire. She should be dead. By all rights, she should have died with the others. But the man called Lone Eagle had spared her, and now he was bleeding because of it. She tightened her arms around herself, squeezing her eyes shut. She had no reason to trust him, yet she had followed him into the wilderness like a frightened child. Was she trading one fate for another? He had spoken little to her, but she had seen the way his own kind looked at him when they had fled. A traitor. The word hung over them both. She was nothing but a prisoner of war, and yet he had thrown himself between her and the men who wanted her dead. Why? A sudden crack of thunder shook the ground, and her head snapped up just in time to see the shadow of a rider break through the trees. Lone Eagle. He slid off the saddle before the horse had even stopped, staggering forward. His face, usually set in an unreadable mask, was drawn tight with pain. He reached for the rock beside her, bracing himself, sucking in sharp breaths. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Then she saw the blood. It stained his fingers, streaked his side, dripping onto the mud below. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen men die before, but something in her recoiled at the thought of him falling here, now, after everything. "They're close," he said, his voice low, urgent. "We move." He reached for her wrist, his grip firm but not cruel. Pulling her up, she stumbled, her limbs stiff with cold, but he did not wait for her to find her footing. He half dragged, half guided her deeper into the night. The storm swallowed them, masking their movements, their presence, but it would not hold their pursuers for long. The wind screamed as they ran, the landscape nothing but a blur of shadow and rain. He led her down into the dry creek bed, their feet slipping in the wet gravel. She had no choice but to follow, heart hammering in her chest. Behind them, a sound cut through the storm. A war cry. They had been found. Lone Eagle yanked her forward, his breath labored. Run. She did. She ran like the devil himself was on her heels, her heartbeat thundering louder than the storm. The night closed around them, and in the distance the hunt began. Rain battered the earth in relentless sheets, turning the dry creek bed into a treacherous path of slick stone and shifting mud. The storm raged overhead, a furious beast tearing at the night, but the sounds behind them were worse. The war cries had stopped. That was not mercy, it was strategy. Lone Eagle's pulse pounded in his ears. Silence meant the warriors had spread out, hunting without sound, closing the distance like wolves circling wounded prey. He forced himself to move faster, dragging Eliza forward. She stumbled, her boots slipping against the wet ground, her breath ragged. She wasn't built for this. He knew that, but there was no room for weakness now. A snap of a branch, a shift in the wind, Lone Eagle pulled her down, just as an arrow sliced through the air where her head had been a heartbeat ago. It struck the rock wall behind them, splintering on impact. She gasped, eyes wide, but he had no time for fear. He pushed her behind the jagged outcrop and pressed a finger to his lips. Her trembling hands covered her mouth, stifling her breath, but her eyes locked onto his. He saw it then, not just terror, but trust. Blind, desperate trust. The next attack would come fast. They always did. He reached for the knife at his belt, his only weapon now. No bow, no rifle. The river had stolen them. He turned his ear toward the storm, listening. The water, the wind, the whisper of boots on wet stone. There, he moved like lightning, spinning around the rock just as the first warrior lunged from the shadows. The man barely had time to react before Lone Eagle's blade found his throat. A gurgled cry, a spray of warmth, and then the body crumpled into the mud. But there was no time to stop. Another shape emerged from the dark, then another. Too many. Lone Eagle grabbed Eliza and ran. The creek bed sloped downward, cutting deeper into the earth. They scrambled over loose rock, skidding on a wet incline, slipping into the unknown. Above them, the warriors followed, their shadows flickering against the storm-lit sky. Lightning flashed, illuminating the path ahead. A river, not deep but fast. The recent rains had swollen it, turning what should have been a narrow trickle into a roaring surge. The current was strong, twisting and hungry, lined with jagged stones and broken branches. Lone Eagle hesitated. To cross it in this storm was madness. Another arrow whistled past. No choice. He seized Eliza's hand and pulled her into the water. The current slammed into them instantly, dragging at their legs, clawing at their bodies with icy fingers. Eliza gasped, struggling to keep her footing. He held on to her wrist, pushing forward, step by agonizing step. Then the riverbed vanished beneath them. The current tore them apart. For a brief, weightless moment, the world disappeared into chaos. Water swallowed them whole, a crushing force that sent them tumbling through the dark. Eliza's scream was lost in the flood, her hands clawing at empty space as the river yanked her away. Lone Eagle fought against the pull, lungs burning, vision spinning. He surfaced, gulping air, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then he saw her. Further down, her body thrown against the rocks, barely keeping above the churning whitecaps. He lunged, arms slicing through the water. The current fought to drag him under, but he pushed harder, his muscles screaming. Eliza slipped beneath the surface. No, with a final, desperate stroke, he reached her, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her up. She coughed violently, her hands gripping onto him, but there was no time for relief. The river was carrying them straight toward the bend, a sharp drop where the water crashed against jagged boulders below. Lone Eagle kicked, fighting against the current, searching. There, a fallen tree jutted out over the riverbank. Their only chance. Eliza. His voice barely carried over the storm. The branch, grab it. She turned her head, eyes wild with fear, but she understood. He pushed her toward it, using the last of his strength to propel her forward. She reached out, fingers scraping the wet bark. A scream tore from her throat as she nearly missed. But then she caught it, clutching it with all her strength. Lone Eagle was not so lucky. The current yanked him past her, dragging him toward the rocks. Eliza. His voice was raw. And then she let go. She let go. For an impossible moment. He couldn't believe it. She flung herself toward him, fingers grasping for his arm, her other hand barely catching a root just before they both were lost to the current. She held on, her entire body trembling with strain, teeth clenched in effort. "Take my hand," she cried. For the first time, it was he who hesitated. He had saved her because it was his debt, his choice. But this was something else, something unspoken, something he could not name, and it terrified him. But there was no time for hesitation. He reached, their fingers locked. With a guttural cry, she pulled him toward the root, their bodies slamming against the mud of the riverbank. He clawed for a grip, dragged them both onto solid ground, and then collapsed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. just gasping, just breathing. Then, slowly, Eliza turned her head toward him, her face streaked with mud and exhaustion. "You saved me," she whispered. He swallowed, his own breath uneven. "You saved me first." A strange silence settled between them, heavy with something that neither of them dared name. But the night was not done with them yet. Above, through the trees, the flicker of torchlight appeared. The warriors had found them. Eliza met his eyes. Lone Eagle forced himself to his feet. The hunt was not over. The prairie stretched before them, an open graveyard of broken land and endless sky. But there was no time to run. The torchlight flickered through the trees behind them, weaving shadows between the trunks, growing closer with every breath. Lone Eagle clenched his jaw. The hunt had led them here, to the outskirts of a long-abandoned trading post, little more than a skeleton of settlement, its wooden bones rotting beneath the sky. A single burned-out cabin stood at its heart, half collapsed, the remains of a war long past. A fitting place to make a final stand. Eliza stood beside him, drenched and shivering, but her eyes held something new, not just fear, determination. "They're coming," she whispered. He already knew. They had no time to run, no place to hide. His people were the best hunters on the plains. They would not stop. They could not. Lone Eagle tightened his grip on his knife. The blade felt small in his hand. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Eliza turned, scanning the wreckage of the settlement. Her breath caught, and she darted toward a pile of half-buried debris. She fell to her knees, fingers clawing through the dirt and ash. For a heartbeat, he almost told her to stop. Then she lifted something from the ground, a rifle. Rust marred the barrel, but it was intact. A weapon, a chance. Lone Eagle took it from her hands, testing the weight, the balance. The powder horn lay nearby, dry despite the rain, tucked in the wreckage. A miracle. He worked fast, loading the rifle with practiced hands. Eliza pulled a second weapon from the dirt, a rusted hatchet. It wasn't much, but she gripped it with white-knuckled resolve. The torches fanned out now, spreading around them. The warriors knew they would not attack blindly. They would circle, waiting for an opening. Lone Eagle breathed deep, steadied himself. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the raw scent of wet earth and blood. This was the moment. A shape moved in the dark. Lone Eagle raised a rifle and fired. The shot cracked the night in half, sending a warrior tumbling from the underbrush, his body twisting in the dirt. For a moment there was silence. Then came the cry. It was not rage, not grief. It was a challenge. Lone Eagle knew that voice. Red Hawk, his blood brother. The torches shifted, and the Comanche stepped into the dim light of the ruined settlement. He was taller than Lone Eagle, broader, his face painted in deep lines of war. The others fanned out behind him, waiting, watching. "This is foolish, brother," Red Hawk called. His voice was calm, steady. "You cannot win." Lone Eagle did not move. "I did not seek victory." "Then what?" Red Hawk took another step forward. "What is she to you?" "Nothing. A prisoner. A debt that does not need to be paid." Lone Eagle's fingers curled tighter around the rifle. He did not have an answer, not one that would change the inevitable. "You are one of us," Red Hawk continued. "We do not have to kill you." Lone Eagle's jaw tensed. "If I surrender, she dies. She is already dead." Eliza stiffened beside him, her grip tightening on the hatchet. Red Hawk lifted his own weapon, a long, curved blade that glinted in the dying firelight. He held it out, tilting his head. "Face me, brother," he said, "or let the woman die." Lone Eagle exhaled slowly. There was no other way. He dropped the rifle. Eliza's breath hitched. "No." He stepped forward. The others fell back, giving them space, forming a silent ring around the ruined settlement. The world shrank to nothing but the two of them, circling, their breaths steaming in the cold air. Red Hawk moved first, striking low and fast. Lone Eagle barely dodged, the blade slicing past his ribs too close. He countered with sharp jab, catching Red Hawk's arm, drawing blood. A good hit, but not enough. Red Hawk struck again, faster this time, their blades clashing in the dark. Sparks flashed. Their breath came in ragged gasps, boots kicking up dirt and ash. Lone Eagle was fast, but Red Hawk was stronger. A sudden blow knocked him off balance. He stumbled, and Red Hawk was there, driving him back, forcing him down, pinning him against the splintered remains of a wooden post. Lone Eagle's knife slipped from his grasp. The blade pressed against his throat. Red Hawk leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "You were my brother." Lone Eagle did not look away. "And you were mine." For the first time, something flickered in Red Hawk's eyes. A hesitation, a doubt. It was all Lone Eagle needed. With a sharp twist, he drove his knee into Red Hawk's gut, knocking the wind from his lungs. The blade slipped. Lone Eagle seized it, spinning, reversing their positions. Now it was Red Hawk who lay beneath the blade. Silence. The warriors waited, watching. One motion. That was all it would take. Lone Eagle's fingers trembled. Red Hawk did not struggle. He only stared, waiting for the final blow. But Lone Eagle could not do it. Slowly he stepped back. The warriors shifted, murmured. Red Hawk sat up, his breath coming fast. He touched his throat where the blade had rested. Then, slowly he stood. His gaze met Lone Eagle's. Then he turned away. Without a word, he walked past the ring of warriors. One by one, they followed. Lone Eagle did not move until the last of them had disappeared into the night. Then, and only then, did he turn back to Eliza. She was staring at him, her face unreadable. Why did they leave? He exhaled, letting the weight settle over him. Because I am already dead to them. She opened her mouth, closed it, then she nodded. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it the last remnants of storm. It was over. But Lone Eagle knew the past never let go so easily. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and dying embers as dawn crept over the land, painting the prairie in hues of gold and crimson. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained in the mud-streaked ruins of the abandoned settlement, in the silent footprints leading away into the wild, in the two figures standing at the edge of the world they had barely survived. Lone Eagle pulled the saddle onto his horse, tightening the straps with steady hands. His body ached, the bruises and wounds of night settling into his flesh like ghosts that refused to leave. But he did not falter. There was still one last path to take. Eliza stood a few paces away, watching him, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. She had said little since the battle, since Red Hawk had turned away instead of finishing what had been started. Lone Eagle knew that she was trying to make sense of it, to understand the rules of a world she had never been meant to survive. She stepped forward. "So that's it." Her voice was quiet, but there was something beneath it, something raw. He did not turn immediately. Instead, he secured his pack, adjusting the weight. Only when the task was finished did he face her. "You are close to the settlement," he said. 2 days walk south. You will find help there." Eliza's brow furrowed. "And what about you?" Lone Eagle inhaled slowly. He looked out over the prairie, the land stretching endlessly before him, open yet suffocating. "I go where I must." A flicker of something passed across her face, but it was gone before he could name it. She took another step forward, her voice sharper now. "You could come with me." Lone Eagle studied her, searching for the meaning behind her words. Was it gratitude? A debt she felt she owed? Or was it something else? Something even more dangerous? "I cannot," he said. She swallowed hard. "Why not?" His jaw tightened. He could have given her many reasons. That he was an outcast now, a man without a people, a traitor to his own kind. That no town would welcome a Comanche warrior, no matter how many white lives he had saved. That men like him did not belong in her world. But instead, he said the only truth that mattered. Because you are free. Eliza's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She looked at him as though trying to memorize him, as though trying to etch his face into memory before it was gone forever. Lone Eagle turned back to his horse, readying himself to ride. He had made his choice the moment he had saved her life. He had walked this path knowing there was no return. He had done what needed to be done, and now it was time to disappear into the land that had made him. A hand touched his arm. He froze. It was the first time she had willingly reached for him. Eliza's fingers barely pressed against his skin, but the touch was real, warm, a tether to something neither of them had the words for. "You don't have to keep running," she said, barely more than a whisper. Lone Eagle turned to face her, his dark eyes meeting hers. And for a moment, he allowed himself to wonder, to imagine a life beyond the war cries, beyond the blood and the ghosts of the past. A life where he was simply a man, and she was simply a woman, and the world did not care what they had been before. But the world did care, and men like him did not get to imagine. He reached up, gently taking her hand and lowering it away. "You have a home to find." A storm passed through her expression. Frustration, sadness, something else he dared not name. But she did not fight him. Instead, she nodded. The wind stirred the tall grass around them. The sun climbed higher, stretching shadows long and thin. It was time. Lone Eagle mounted his horse, the leather creaking beneath him. He took the reins, guiding the animal to turn. Eliza stepped back, her arms tightening around herself. "Will I ever see you again?" Lone Eagle hesitated. Then, with the faintest hint of a smile, he said, "The wind carries many things." It was not a promise, not a lie, just the truth. Then, without another word, he urged his horse forward. The earth whispered beneath the hooves, the wind rushing past his ears. He did not look back. And yet, long after he had vanished into the horizon, Eliza still stood there, watching the place where he had been. She did not know why, but she whispered his name to the wind, and somehow she swore she heard it whisper back,